Fine, fine. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Ariel Kahana, the CEO of Velnet in France, our office in Paris. And I'm very happy to be with you tonight. And to introduce this Zoom conference, I would like to say, as we celebrate this year the 100 years of the San Remo conference, we decided to organize a series of 3 virtual conferences to raise awareness about the historical and strategical importance of San Remo and its impact on current geopolitical issues in the Middle East, especially with the American peace plan. The first edition we had organized was more focused on the historical and strategical background of the conference. For this second round, we would like to discuss political and diplomatic issues and the future of the peace plan for the Middle East. In the first edition that will take place later in July, we shall analyze the legal aspect. We are very honored today to gather online 3 very prominent speakers: Jasmine Greenblatt, Ambassador Dore Gold, Ambassador Christophe Farnaud, and Anna Azari. All of them will be introduced to you by our friend General Michael Zorg, who will be the moderator of this Zoom conference. The event tonight is part of the LNet's online political exchange program, which enabled us since the beginning of the health crisis to hold more than 40 virtual conferences. We at LNet are convinced that Europe can and must play a role in helping the parties find a path to reconciliation and peace. And for that, Europe must have a positive vision and a more balanced attitude. We also believe that among friends and allies that we can express disagreement without resorting to condemnation and threats. And as Shimon Peres was used to say, to make peace is like tango. It takes 2. There is Israel for sure, but there is also the Palestinian Authority, which has its share of responsibility in the situation of blocking the peace process, and which, unfortunately, we think it's never questioned about its dysfunction and its mistake. But to move forward, we have to get out of the illusion of the 2 states to succeed in the 2-state solution, as Ron Dermer said in an article published in the Washington Post. If we are going through tough time worldwide, and particularly in the Middle East, we have also an opportunity to discuss and maybe define new parameters to reach peace in the region. That's what LNet promotes through strategic dialogue, and we hope that the discussion tonight will pave the way to dialogue and mutual comprehension. I would like to recall that this Zoom is on the record today, and we have a lot of journalists with us. We are very happy to welcome them and to welcome also all of you. And I'm very happy to give now the floor to our first speaker, Anna Azari, for introducing and opening remarks. Anna Azari, please, you have the floor.
Unmute.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. First of all, I want to congratulate LNet, not only for convening people on interesting subjects once in a while, but also for choosing today's subject, this 100 years of San Remo conference. One of the reasons I think it's so good, it's a good title and a good opportunity, is because somehow, without us noticing, the Jewish narration got lost in space. It seems that especially in Europe, Israelis maybe being self-assured, having such a wonderful state, forgot to go back to basics, to tell the story of international legitimacy and historical legitimacy of our presence in the land of Israel. And this narration became something very deep on the background of our daily lives. which lets people, the worst part of the people who think differently, a free game in introducing incorrect historical narrations. So the fact that San Remo wasn't even the first international basis for creating a Jewish homeland 100 years ago in the land of what used to be called Palestine is not common knowledge at all by now. If we move to current days, to today, and to the situation as it is, a moment before, I don't know, actually what? Maybe today's President Trump's speech, or a decision that Israel will take after the Trump plan. We mostly see that Israel is treated with some kind of new kind of diplomacy, megaphone diplomacy. Very often, instead of talking to the Israelis, we get those declarations, letters, statements, and so on, threatening with different punishments for decisions which were not yet taken. I'm not sure that other countries are treated like that normally. The last one was the letter, the European letter against annexation signed, published a couple of days ago. Hopefully the last one. Now, on the positive side, we do have a new government. It took us a very long time this time to get around to building a new government, and actors on the international arena and are starting to speak with us, to talk to us, and not only to talk at us. Already during the last months, first of all, we have quite an amazing activity, mostly not Zoom activity, rather phone activity with our new government. A lot of discussions with European leaders. I, of course, coming from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, know more in detail about the activities of the Foreign Minister of Israel, and I think that we are in the midst of a wave of conversations with European leaders. And the interesting part is that we are not only talking about bilateral conversation, but also conversations with High Representative Borrell and people from the structures of the European Union, not only country by country. I hope that the countries, at least some of the countries, will give us support inside the structure of European Union, whatever the government decides in a couple of weeks. I think that going back to the title of this conference, I'm coming back again to Elnet and to history. I think that giving this name and this angle for our today's meeting gives the right framework for discussion of not only of the past, but also of what is about to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I should mention that Ambassador Anna Azari is Deputy Director General of European Affairs at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let's now move to our discussion. Thank you all for joining us. The title of this conference is 100 years after the San Remo Conference, the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace. So as you can understand from the title, we are combining a historical perspective with contemporary discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 100 years ago at San Remo, the international community and mostly European major actors recognized the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their own ancestral homeland. And today, 100 years on, we have a thriving state of Israel. We have an unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we tried for many years to resolve it. I myself was involved in negotiations for well over 20 years with them. We have the Trump plan setting the context for discussion today and offering a new and a different paradigm. And we have the stated intent of the government of Israel to apply Israeli law or sovereignty in parts of the West Bank. So this is the context of what we're going to discuss today. And we'd like to look at how you factor in to this discussion the historical perspective, the legal dimension, and the contemporary geopolitical dimension of this. We have three excellent and well-equipped panelists to discuss this. Jason Greenblatt, former US President Special Envoy to the Middle East and one of the main architects of the US Peace Plan. I've had the pleasure of interacting with Jason and always was impressed by his seriousness, intelligence, and his ability to listen. We have Ambassador Christophe Farnaud, who is the Director for North Africa and the Middle East at the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, and is a very well-known diplomat. And we have Ambassador Dore Gold, who is the President of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and a former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also a well-experienced diplomat and analyst. Our program will be, each of the speakers will give opening remarks on the topics, and we send them some questions or topics to relate to for about 8 minutes. Then we'll have a moderated discussion. Then we'll open up to the participants to ask questions and offer some comments, so we have a discussion. And I would like to start with you, Jason, given the fact that the context today is the Trump peace plan, and if you can start by offering us your perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the host for organizing this important conference. I'll start just by addressing something that Ariel quoted about it takes two to tango, and I think that is accurate, but really it takes a conga line. I'm now out of the White House for 8 months. I spent 3 years in the region, deeply enmeshed in discussions ranging from ordinary Israelis and Palestinians and other Arabs in the region, to the leadership in the region, to the leadership around the world. And last night I did an interview on Al Jazeera. It was a debate almost between myself and Dr. Nabil Shaf. And I realized how much nothing has changed. And Mike, I agree, the historical context is important, the legal context is important, but the reality is we will never, ever be able to get the two sides to agree on the historical context and the legal context. And on the legal side in particular, we will never get both sides to accept the legal arguments that they have, and there is no court, and there's no organization, and there's no country or group of countries in the world that will ever be able to make a binding legal decision on the legal arguments. And therefore, I feel more and more, and I still spend a great deal of time each and every week during these past 8 months, and I hope to continue to do so. I feel more and more that we have done a tremendous disservice to the peace process by digging in our heels and demanding that certain historical or legal contexts are the only way forward. And let me explain what I mean. Last night, Dr. Nabil Shaf, and I don't speak Arabic, but they had an interpreter, railed for 4 or 5 minutes in each of his answers with the same talking points that have been said by the Palestinian side for years. Blame everything on Israel, or in last night's case, blame everything on Israel and the United States, accept no responsibility for the issues, don't acknowledge that some of the suffering that the Palestinians have gone through is through bad leadership decisions and lots of things that they did themselves. Demand that international law, how he defines it, is the only way forward. And if that is going to be the attitude of the Palestinian leadership, the European Union, the United Nations, and the world, we will be talking about this till we are, till our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be on this Zoom screen or whatever type of technology they're going to be using in the future. And that would be a tremendous tragedy for the Palestinians, who deserve dignity and security and respect and prosperity. And it would be a tremendous tragedy for the Israelis, who deserve safety and security. And it would be a tremendous tragedy for the mostly young generation in the region who are thriving for different kinds of lives. I don't subscribe to the theory that this is a Middle East peace process. Solving this conflict is not going to solve the rest of the very tough and tragic conflicts in the region. It may take the temperature down a bit, but solving this conflict is not the key to peace in the Middle East, and I think that people need to get off that concept. I don't think that, I don't use the word annexation like Mike and others on this call. I use application of Israeli sovereignty or extension of Israeli sovereignty or application of Israeli law is the correct terminology, not annexation. The constant blame against that as to why that is not the peace process, and watching the rhetoric over the past couple of weeks as a sovereign nation, Israel decides what it wants to do, which it has the right to do, and none of us have the right to tell it to do otherwise. We might be able to give it advice, we might be able to encourage, but to tell them that they don't have the right to make this decision, to allow the Israeli citizens who have lived in limbo because of Palestinian leadership veto and intransigence is thoroughly inappropriate. But moreover, to blame the so-called annexation as the reason for the lack of peace and the reason we can't move forward, I think is completely incorrect. And not to focus on some of the gating issues before you even get to the difficult issues of boundaries and Jerusalem and the so-called refugees, the Palestinians who have been kept in these wretched refugee camps to live life in limbo instead of having appropriate lives because nobody wants to take care of them and they want to use them for a political purpose. Those issues, of course, have to be negotiated directly by the parties with help from around the world. But we have to acknowledge that the Palestinian leadership is fractured. You have a leadership in Ramallah who refuses to engage, who trashed the Trump peace plan before we even came out with the peace plan, who disengaged from the Trump administration in December of 2017, and have been hoping ever since then that President Trump would no longer occupy the Oval Office. And then you have the bloodthirsty Iran-funded terrorists in Gaza who subjugate and cause suffering, not only for Israel, but for the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. Even if President Abbas were willing to engage, whether with or without the Trump peace plan, with the government of Israel, how do we resolve how to deal with the Palestinians in Gaza? How do we fold them into any kind of solution to give them better lives? I think that people are focused on the wrong issues. I'm not advocating what we put forth in the plan, though I think it represents a fair, rational, implementable basis to begin negotiations between the two sides. But I am saying that the world is looking down the wrong lane when they think that they could constantly say the same things over and over, point to UN resolutions that are both ambiguous and not binding and are interpreted differently around the world, and think that eventually that is going to bring peace. And that is a tragedy for the entire region, and I think we all need to do better so we could bring better lives to all of those people who are suffering from this long-standing conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Let me now turn to Ambassador Christophe Farnaud. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Elnet, and in particular to Ariel Kahana, whom I met a few months ago, and I'm happy to see again. And thanks, Elnet, once again, not just for using this anniversary to organize just an event, but it's not every event. I think that given the current circumstances, it's good that we can have this dialogue that was mentioned before. I think it's the only way for us to avoid misunderstandings and maybe be able to progress. So I will be very brief for these opening remarks. First of all, of course, just to mention that 100 years after the San Remo conference, I think we are at a turning point. And yes, in the last century, a lot has been achieved, basically. And just mentioning the creation of Israel is enough, I think, to see what a change it was. And I just not want to mention it. I want to mention as well the very strong relations that were built on that. Israel in itself has known tremendous successes, but we also are proud of having built the relation we have with Israel, and it's strong in many ways. It's not now time to go into detail of it, but I just want to mention how important it is to us. And we really want, as France, to go further with Israel on that. Second thing, yes, on the peace process itself, or more on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which was an Arab-Israeli conflict before that, a lot has been achieved through terrible times as well. If you look back at the beginning of it and where we stand now, a lot has been achieved. But and I won't go into the detail of it. Once again, we won't have time for that. But it's true that in the last years, there has been a clear lack of progress, which is not satisfactory for anyone. And there has been tragedies, and we do not underestimate the losses that it caused to Israel in particular. But that said, should we say that there is no way out, no possibility by keeping the international framework that has been slowly established? For us, the answer is no. We consider that the solution should be reached within the international framework and the parameters that were agreed along the years. So, and that's France's position. You know, and I will just give it in 3 elements. One is the framework, and so the framework is clearly international law, including the UN Charter and the UN resolutions and the agreed parameters. But I have no doubt that all participants and listeners know about it, so allow me not to go into the detail of it, but we can get back to it later. So the framework, of course, the goal being to establish 2 states, so it's the famous 2-state solution. We still believe in it more than ever, I must say. To us, it's the only way to have a lasting solution. 2 states living in peace and security, which is key. As you remember, France has always been committed to Israel's security and will remain committed to it very strongly. And third, of course, then there is a method and approach, and this has to be through direct negotiations between the parties. When you have a conflict, the only way out is to have the parties decide together what they want to make out of it and what kind of solution they want. Otherwise, you bring only more trouble at some point. So these are the 3 key elements. And what we want to do is to go further along these lines. Against that backdrop, clearly the potential annexation of territories would not help. And it would, in a way, jeopardize the 3 elements I mentioned. It would deviate from international law, and including the resolutions that I mentioned. And let me just mention Resolution 242 and 2334, for instance, which has to do with the basically relying on the principle of acquisition of territory by force, which is not recognized. And second, it would call into question the 2-state solution, because clearly from what we know, but once again, nothing has happened, and the issue is not to prejudge anything, but just to think and look at what we've heard. It might endanger the solution of 2 states by making it impossible to have a viable Palestinian state. And third, of course, it seems that it contradicts the logic of the negotiations in itself, which for us cannot be satisfactory. So if you look at it, clearly there is an issue. And once again, it has to be discussed. And this is what we've been doing, by the way. We've been talking to our Israeli friends. Our minister spoke to Minister Ashkenazi just a few days ago about that. among friends, you have to talk frankly, and that's what we've been doing. But clearly, then we have to mention the fact that if it went on, such a decision, of course, would have negative consequences. That's the reason why, basically, we have to be very cautious about that. It would have consequences for the Palestinians and the Israelis themselves, probably, because basically it might play into the hands of extremists, basically. And this is what we want to avoid. That's fundamental. And it would have an impact not just on Israel and the Palestinians, it could also have an impact on the regions. As you know, we are not the only ones to say so. If you listen to very moderate leaders like King Abdullah of Jordan say these days, I think the message is very clear. And it would have also an impact, I think, beyond the region, because clearly we are neighbors. We are not, the security of Israel in a way is the security of the whole region, and it has an impact even beyond that. And so for us, it's a real concern. So once again, and I agree with what in that regard Anna Azari said, the idea is not to prejudge, and we won't do that. Precisely what we want is to talk and be very clear about the fact that unilateral actions have to be avoided on both sides, by the way, from Israel, basically, and that's the key point, but also talk to the Palestinians. Our message is that basically the key point would be for the parties to get back to the negotiations. So this is why we have these clear messages that we won't recognize Israel's sovereignty over annexed territories, but we also want from the Palestinian side that they still stick to the agreements. And so we support the establishment of a stable, viable, democratic state in the Palestinian territories. But for instance, we also ask them till now to do what is necessary to have elections, free elections. That would be a credit to them and would allow to have a stable neighbor for Israel. So, and of course, if despite all that, and Israel wanted still to go ahead, I think we also have to be clear that this would not go unanswered. And once again, now is not the time, it's not to talk about the detail of it, because we are still at an early stage and we want to do everything to build positively on what is happening now, but we also have to say it. And so I don't want to be too long. And so clearly, there is this very strong relationship with Israel. We still want to build on it. And when I say we, is as France, but also as a European country. The European Union is the first partner for Israel in many ways, economically, but also beyond that, with a lot of cooperations in high technologies, in agriculture, in every field, and trade, of course. And so there's the possibility to go further in that direction. And if things go into the right direction, we can even upgrade this relation. That's basically the prospect we have. But then, if there's another path, there will be other answers as well, obviously. And before ending, I just want to say that goes, once again, into the direction of building more dialogue. Really, that's what we want. Dialogue with Israel, dialogue with the Palestinians, dialogue with our American friends, dialogue among Europeans as well, because as you know, the Europeans are not as well very united. A dialogue with the Arab moderate countries, the neighbors of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, which have a direct interest in it as well. And that's just a few examples of things we might do. Allow me to stop here. I will be more than happy to discuss and answer questions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Farnaud. Let me now turn to our third speaker, Ambassador Dore Gold, please. Dore? Is he on? Mm-hmm. Is he muted?
There you go.
Dore, now, Dore, you have to be unmuted. He's mute.
Yeah, he needs to unmute himself. Dore, there's supposed to be a question on your screen that asks for you to unmute.
You have to unmute. You have to unmute. No.
Yeah, he needs to accept unmuting.
Dore, you have to unmute or accept the option of unmuting.
Do you see on the bottom of your screen a button on the left says mute and unmute?
Dore, can you hear us? Unmute, unmute. Sorry. Can you unmute him?
I asked to unmute.
We're sorry, but let me see. I'm calling him. He's unmuting, nothing happens.
All right, so we'll try to fix the issue. In the meantime, maybe let's start with the first question, and once we solve the issue with Ambassador Gold, we'll continue with his opening statement. So I would like to give the floor to Ivan Levingston from Bloomberg to ask a question.
Thank you so much. My question, I guess, is for Anna. You know, European countries have taken a very strong stance against Israel's plans for annexation, and so I'm wondering if you're anticipating any economic sanctions from individual countries, and why you think European countries have been so much more strong in their warnings on an annexation compared to past moves like the Jerusalem embassy move.
First of all, I don't think that European countries have one voice on this issue, even though a lot of them consider the application of Israeli law, a decision like that, problematic. I think Israel have a big number of friends inside Europe, and I don't expect that Europe or as an organization is going to be able to come to some kind of decision on sanctions as a EU, as the European Union. Now, speaking on individual countries, as far as we can see, of course, we'll have to wait, first of all, for the decision, and secondly, for the reaction. The structure right now is very weird when the reaction is coming before the decision. But as far as we can see, the majority of countries is interested to deal with the issue, even the ones who are not pleased in theory. They are interested in dealing with the issue through the European organizations and not necessarily bilaterally. Maybe I'm, of course, wrong, but at this point, we don't see clear-cut sanctions or full-fledged sanctions on their way. But we will have to wait and see how it develops. For me, part of this is a bit strange because when reacting to the Trump plan, a lot of people in Europe are so opposed to it that it looks as if they're looking as a solution towards status quo ante, towards what we had before the introduction of the plan, as if everything was so wonderful during this time. I do think that the best thing that Europeans and other world leaders can do is to push both of the sides to direct discussions. At this point, I don't see it happening. To put pressure always on one side, it's strange because we have to remember that the Palestinians decided not to negotiate with Netanyahu government, and I'm not talking about the last one. I'm talking about all the governments from day one, and I think the push should be on both sides to sit down and talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Until we solve the technical problem with Ambassador Gold, I would like to address questions to our panelists, one to Jason and one to Ambassador Farnaud. Let me start with Jason and ask you the following. When the Trump administration launched its peace plan in late January, it explained that since the old paradigm, which governed Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for many years, failed, there's room for a new one, a new paradigm. So how would you present the new paradigm offered by the Trump plan? And in that context, where do you see the issue of the application of Israeli law sovereignty? I mean, there is a debate whether applying Israeli sovereignty now helps the US plan or undermines the US plan. So if you can address these questions, we'd be grateful.
Sure, Mike. So I would not say that we have changed the paradigm. I would describe what we did in the dozens of pages of this peace vision plus the economic plan is define the paradigm. So I'm well aware that the gold standard in the international community is the so-called two-state solution. But nobody really understands what that means. If it means, like some argue, that it is and I think Secretary Guterres made a comment like this the other day or today, that it is a fully sovereign, contiguous state of Palestine with no restrictions. Well, first of all, Palestine would never be contiguous because you have the Gaza Strip and you have an area of land that I refer to as Judea and Samaria and others call the West Bank. So right away, contiguity to the tune of millions of people is not possible. Full sovereignty. If any country thinks that they have the right to demand of Israel that Israel does not have the obligation or the necessity to protect its citizens, and would demand that Israel accept a Palestinian state that would be like what happened in Gaza, where they could be threatened day in and day out with terror tunnels, balloons with weapons on them, rocket fire. That's not going to happen either, and no country has the right to demand of another country to accept such standards. So what we did is we built in to our plan, again, not a new paradigm, but a defined paradigm. Israel would have overriding security control, make sure that Israelis and Palestinians are safe, give as much security to the Palestinians to handle. They would take them time to come up to speed. Yes, it's true, there's been good cooperation on the Palestinian security forces and Israel, other than some bumps in the road. But it will take time for the Palestinians to be able to come up to speed. After all, Israel has dealt with this now for 70 years. But if the Palestinians end up not doing a good enough job or going in the reverse direction, we gave Israel the right to go back in and protect its citizens, which is first and foremost, the most important obligation of any government. And we did it in a way that would allow them not to be condemned by the world and the United Nations for protecting their citizens. So I would say that what we did is very much let everybody understand what it could mean to have a Palestinian state, how the Palestinian state could thrive and prosper despite restrictions. And if the Palestinian leadership takes its job seriously and allows the Palestinians to thrive and prosper, working hand in hand with Israel where needed, it will be fine. But if they don't take their job seriously and they can't contain terror, then we gave Israel the ability to be sure that they could take care of themselves as they deserve to be able to do. Mike, did I answer all the questions or did I leave something out? You're on mute?
No, there was a second part to my question which had to do with the relationship between the peace plan and the application of Israeli sovereignty.
Yeah, sorry. So first of all, I happen to be in favor of it, but it is an Israeli government decision. I'm not an Israeli citizen. And as Secretary Pompeo said the other day, the decision does rest with the Israeli government. Israel first has to decide what it needs and wants. And then I think they will be working, as you've seen from the news media the last couple of days, working very closely with the White House. I don't see it as undermining the plan at all. In fact, I see it as an essential part of the plan. When the plan was finally released in January, the goal was, and Prime Minister Netanyahu and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz supported the plan, to allow Israel to move forward with it, but at the same time protect an area of land that would have been designated or would be designated for a Palestinian state, a future Palestinian state, and not build on that area during a period of 4 years in order for the Palestinian Authority or whoever will be negotiating on behalf of the Palestinians to get their house in order. If they get their house in order, that would include again Gaza, and negotiate in good faith with Israel, then we wanted them to have a 4-year runway to be able to do that and perhaps reach a peace agreement if that were possible. If that doesn't happen, then Israel is not bound beyond that 4-year period. But I think it only is a natural outcome of the plan. But it is up to Israel to decide whether the potential consequences of the annexation are worth it. And I wouldn't presume to suggest that I know what is going through the Prime Minister's mind and the intelligence reports he's reading and the many private conversations he's having with leaders around the world and the advice that he's getting from so many different people. So it's not for me to say what he should do, but I would say that if he were to do something, he would be doing it in the context of at least what I believe we wrote in the peace plan and that was released in January.
Okay, thanks. So before I turn to you, Ambassador Farnaud, I believe we fixed the problem with Dore Gold. So let me give you the floor to give your opening remarks, and then we'll go back to the discussion, please.
Okay, I want to make sure do you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, so now we can start. I think it's extremely important that we get our terminology right in having a discussion which touches on international law, which touches on diplomacy, which touches on current events. You know, part of what I did when I was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, I used to read the texts of previous ambassadors when they would speak there. And I ran into a text, actually a letter to the Secretary General from July 10th, 1967. And the letter was written by Abba Eban, our foreign minister. And he was complaining, this is shortly after the Six-Day War, that Israel's plans in Jerusalem were being called to annexation. He said, no, this is an extension of Israeli law and jurisdiction to Eastern Jerusalem. That's what Eban said back then. And, you know, the same arguments were raised. We got through them, and we managed to push diplomacy in the direction of eventually the Security Council adopting Resolution 242 and many other accomplishments at that time. Today, we're using the terminology unilateral act. Israel should not engage in a unilateral act. But, you know, if we work in the context of the Trump plan, we're talking about an act which leads to the Palestinians obtaining 70% of the West Bank and Israel obtaining 30% of the West Bank. Doesn't sound like a classic unilateral act. And I think it's something people should pay much more attention to. And I can get into other definitions, but they become tedious. I think the communication we're having now is very important. And Zoom is a great development for not only for plagues, like what we're enduring now, but it's also very important for opening lines of communication. I think we have not spoken sufficiently to the European side. And what I found when I was active in Israeli diplomacy in 2015 and 2016 is we would open channels to France, for example. We had the French diplomat here just a few minutes ago, and we began areas of cooperation that didn't exist before. So to summarize and to bring my remarks to a close, I think open lines of communication are extremely important. I think, unfortunately, on the Palestinian side, there has been no communication, none with Israel, none with the United States, and I'm not sure what the quality of the communication is to Europe. That has to change. You can't have any kind of a negotiated settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when your machinery is on mute. And I think if we use real definitions of international terms, I think that leads us away from just using terminology which is there to attack the other side without suggesting tangible ways of moving forward. One last insight I wanted to share with you. I read Ambassador Dermer's piece in the Washington Post. And one of the ideas I think he was trying to get across was that the old process wasn't working. And one thing I think the Trump plan tries to do is it tries to make a workable peace process or lay down parameters that will work. Anybody who thinks we're going to pull 500,000 Israelis out of the West Bank, doesn't know what he's talking about. We have to address the issue of Israeli settlements. It's one of the core issues that's raised in Oslo for final status. But we're not going to, pull all these people out. We have to come up with another construct, and that is what the Trump plan does. And we're not going to, again, rely on international forces in the Jordan Valley. That is completely unrealistic. The people of Israel will not support that. But we can come up with a different construct, which is suggested in the Trump plan. So let's get out of formulae that are not going to work. They won't be accepted by the people of Israel. And I think we can come up with other formulae that will attract, of course, the Israeli population, but will also attract the Palestinians. And I think that's what the Trump plan's trying to do. So we should give it a chance. And I think we will perhaps get to first base in peacemaking, which nobody has done for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dore. I would like to ask one more question to Ambassador Farnaud, and then open the floor to participants to ask questions. And my question to you is the following. You mentioned the well-known French and European position that the Israelis and Palestinians should base themselves on established international mechanisms, UN resolutions, international law, and so on. Talk about or aim at a two-state solution based on a negotiated settlement. How do you answer criticism from Israelis, Americans, and others who tell you that the parties have tried this paradigm for well over 2.5 decades, they failed, and that even if you get the parties to sit down and negotiate today, it will lead nowhere. There will not be a breakthrough. Maybe will even do some damage. So assuming that paradigm didn't work, why do you keep repeating it? And do you have any alternative in mind?
Thank you very much. Well, first, just let me be clear. It's not just the French or the European position in a way, as was shown by the debate at the United Nations yesterday, and by some recent statements by the UN Secretary General, for instance. It is a position that is widely shared. Of course, maybe there may be nuances, but many people around the world and who are interested in this key topic share this position. So it might mean that there is some truth in it. And yes, you're right. In the last years, we haven't seen satisfactory progress. We even saw in some way terrible events. And so, but does it mean that we should not persevere? I don't think so, because maybe precisely it stopped and should resume, provided, once again, both parties decide to see each other and start to talk. Which is clear is that it cannot be imposed on them by partners, by the international community. It has to come from the Israelis and the Palestinians. But precisely, it cannot be imposed on both parties. So you have to make peace with someone, then you have to talk to these people. So by choosing to try and impose it directly on the Palestinian side, cannot work. It simply can't. To make peace, it takes two to make peace. I won't use the usual phrase to tango, etc., because it's too serious in a way. But clearly, that's the history of humankind. Each time there was a conflict of some sort, you needed both parties to agree to find a settlement. And this is why, as far as we know, this multilateral approach, I mean, I'm talking about international law now, has been considered worldwide as the best way to settle your differences. And by the way, this is why what I said does not just apply to this conflict. It also applies to other areas in the world. And this is why, by the way, what will be done on this particular case might also have an impact on the perception and the treatment of the cases in the world. So that's the key issue. Then, do we have the new paradigm or the new solution? Of course not. I think nobody has. If it was the case, it would be used already. But precisely how to find it, by seriously choosing not to sideline one side and do things on your own, but precisely to sit again with the people you have. And right now, I think that the Palestinian Authority, with its limitations, has shown that they have a moderate approach and start and talk again. And you know, nobody expected the breakthrough of the Oslo agreements when they happened in a way, and they did. And it was something that was worldwide acclaimed. And I think that it created hope in Israel as well as among the Palestinians. So we still think that's the only way to go ahead. If you allow me, I will get back as well to the question that was asked to Anna Azari first about the European sanctions. To be very clear, our approach now is not an approach of threatening or getting to sanctions. And this is why I said it very clearly. What we want is to favor a positive resuming of the talks, and for us, the possibility to enhance the relations we have with Israel. They are based on many agreements. You know, it's just the trade relations are in billions of euros. I mean, it's in last years it was not far from 40 billion euros just trade relationship, to give you an idea. So there's lots of things we have to do. So that's the first point. But then, if things if a decision that is a violation of international law is taken, it has to have consequences. And that's the other point we have to see. And on that, I agree that the European Union is divided, but you cannot just say that there won't be a unity, because in a way the sensitivities are common. Then the decisions can change and evolve, but there's a widely shared analysis about the position I told you. And so I think it has to be taken seriously. All the more so as not all agreements that we have with Israel need the unanimity on their vote. And so you have first the European position that can lead to conclusions, and then you also have, as was mentioned, but that's quite serious, national decisions as well. And so, and that can be coordinated. So this is something that you have to take into account, although once again, for us, it's not the main scenario, and I will get back to what I said before. The best thing is that things do not happen in a way, or more than that, that positive developments happen, and in that we will be ready to support that. Not just as France, but as well as the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe, Jason, you have a question to Ambassador Farnaud.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Ambassador Farnaud, forgive me, I've been out of government now, in particular during this process. So I'd like to understand how France and other countries, because you're not alone, who are gently or strongly threatening Israel with consequences if they move forward with so-called annexation. Yet, when it comes to things like the Palestinian Authorities' pay-to-slave program, where they encourage Palestinians to harm and murder Israelis, using, by the way, French money and other money, your taxpayers' money, or Hamas, when it threatens Israel and fires rockets over, and these things cost, real lives, real destruction. Why are there no similar threats on the side of those types of actions, which to me are far more harmful to the peace effort, far more harmful to life? I'm just curious about that.
Please, unmute. Yeah.
No, let me be, Sorry. No, on that, there is absolutely no hesitation. We are as hard as can be on any violence on any side. And so I'm sorry, but if you just read and take into account what we said and the way we acted each time there was any attack on Israel, I mean, clearly facts show that, I'm sorry to say, but what you described does not correspond to our position. We say it and we do it. And as you know, Hamas is on the list of terrorist organizations of the European Union. And as you know, well, maybe you should know, all the aid we give to the Palestinians is precisely to help and stabilize these territories in a way that favor a peaceful democratic state. So, and so all the projects we have are screened and checked, and of course, if there's changes we have to make, we do make them. So no, we clearly do not compromise on Israel's security in any way. And on that, I can be very clear.
Ariel Kahana.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to questions from participants. And first is Ariel Kahana, diplomatic correspondent of Israel Hayom. Please. Ariel, is he online?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay, thank you. So my question is directed to Mr. Greenblatt. Hello, Jason. There is, I would say, a few possibilities. Sorry, it's messy here. Sorry. So there is few possibilities of discussion here in Israel and probably in the White House as well in the last days, whether to do the entire step in one action and then pay the price, maybe the French price or the European price, as we heard, or do it stage by stage, step by step, one after another, and see whether it goes or not, whether it's good or not. I wonder, Jason, how do you see this issue, this question? Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. It's good to see you, and it's a good question. And I don't mean to be evasive in my answer, but you'll find it evasive. I just don't know enough information as to what is being said to answer it. But one thing I will be clear about, I think that the price that will be paid is going to be fluid. So whether you do it in one shot or multiple stages, I think that countries who want to react to Israel in a negative way will watch and see how things go and either ratchet up the consequences or reduce the consequences depending on how things unfold. So it's a tough question to answer, and I'm ill-equipped to really answer it given that I'm a private citizen now.
Thank you. Let's move to another Israeli journalist, Eldad Beck, please. Unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My actually two questions go to Christophe Farnaud, which made a distinction between international law and what he called accepted parameters, international parameters to the conflict. Now, according to the international law, Israel has actually sovereignty over the West Bank and other territories. The question is, France and the EU, do they recognize this international law, or do they recognize the international parameters which are actually not accepted by some of the parties like Israel? And the second question, you said that this peace plan would endanger the possibility of a two-state solution. The Israeli right is saying that actually this plan will enable such a solution, and it's a continuation of the Oslo process. What is your reaction to that? Thank you.
Hello? I'm sorry, there's no sound. I have no sound.
You didn't hear Mr. Beck's question?
Can you hear us now? Can you hear us?
So we'll try to fix the issue. In the meantime,
there's no sound. I can't hear you.
You can't hear us? Okay.
Cool. All right, so we'll try to fix the issue. In the meantime, I guess we should go for the next question.
But is anybody helping?
We'll try.
Okay. Okay, until we fix that problem.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I have no sound, so I couldn't hear anything of what was said for the last 5 or 6 minutes, or 10 maybe.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, but he didn't hear anything.
Okay, we'll fix it. Let's move on, and let me give the floor to Yotam Confino from I-24.
Hi, everyone. My two questions are for Jason Greenblatt. And Jason, I would just like to ask you, first of all, very few people had predicted that, in fact, Netanyahu and Gantz would one day sit together and discuss annexation. And it seems to be very, very difficult for them. There is no coherence, really, and no statements coming from them about a joint plan. Would it not have been easier for the Trump administration to really go through with this plan had it been either a Gantz government or a Netanyahu government? And the second question is about the violence that everyone is warning will come from this annexation, and that is both the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the UN. Everyone is warning that the steps coming from Israel will surely mean more violence in the West Bank. That was my questions.
So on the first question, would it have been easier? It's so hard to predict, right? You know, Israel is a democracy. You have your unity government, duly elected, and thankfully you're a democracy. So very hard to predict the answer to that question. We deal with the White House is dealing with the cards that have been dealt. And I think there's a strong cooperation with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz. But ultimately, it really does fall back on the Israeli government to make the decision as to which way they want to go. They are not a vassal state of the United States. They're not a puppet state. They are a real country with the right to make their own decisions and face the consequences of those decisions and choose things in a way that protects their national security, which leads me into the second part of your question. There is a lot of threat of that, and I'm not making light of it. Remember, we heard those same threats when the president recognized Jerusalem, when we moved the embassy, when we recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, all historic decisions by President Trump. But I don't have the information to tell you whether those threats are real in this context. And therefore, I respect and acknowledge that the decision-making process that the Prime Minister is going through, and together with alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz, must be extraordinarily challenging for that, among other reasons.
Thank you. Next, Ian Black. Ian, are you with us?
No.
No. Okay. Who's this? Mr. Antebi, please.
Davy Antebi from the, he's the DCM of the Israeli Embassy in Denmark. Please ask your question.
Davy Antebi.
All right.
Is he with us or no?
Yes. Okay, well, I will just read his question out loud. It's a question to Ambassador Farnaud. He mentioned the importance of elections in the Palestinian Authority. He's asking how realistic is this demand when most chances Hamas will win? I don't know if in the meantime, Mr. Farnaud is back with us.
I'm back.
Great, so.
Okay, so.
Sorry for the disturbance, but anyway.
Okay, glad to have you back. So this question, but there was a previous question by another journalist about, you know, when you talk about international law, Israel regards it in a different way. And how do you answer this, the Israeli claim that we have no lesser rights? I'm interpreting his question, no lesser rights in the West Bank. So how do you factor that in? And it's in the context, of course, of 100 years to San Remo.
Yeah, thank you very much. So no, on Palestinian elections, yes, of course, it is very difficult. We do not underestimate it. And I know that the Palestinians themselves say it. And I know there is also, there's for instance, there's the question of organizing the elections first, including the question of Israel, of Jerusalem, etc. And then, of course, there will be there's the challenge of the result of the elections. But, you know, if you want to play the game of democracy, based on the principle that you think that's the best way to avoid further crisis, then you have to take the risk in a way. And basically what we think is that reconciliation, not in a naive way, but political reconciliation and a kind of unity would favor a stable and more lasting possibility for a solution. That's it. So we do not underestimate the difficulties, but the current situation clearly is not satisfactory. What's happening now in Gaza is in the interest of no one, including not in the interest of Israel. So that's the point. But clearly, once again, we do not pretend that we have the solution or that it would be easy. No, clearly not. On the other point, I respect the opinion of the listeners, of course, and we can discuss that. But when you talk about international law, I mean, this is something which is established, which is recognized, which is the basis of the international relations among the states. So it has, and we all play by the rules. So when you refer to resolutions that we're adopting according to the rules of the organization that everybody has accepted as members of the United Nations, I mean, they have to be respected by all the member states. That's the thing. Then, of course, within that framework, and that's why I use the word framework, it's the broad, it's once again the set of rules and the existing system within which then you promote your positions. So that's exactly where we stand. This is why we mention it. And once again, since the Second World War, it's been the common perception that having this multilateral system is the best way precisely to settle differences, because the world is made of differences between states, and do it in the most satisfactory way. It's complex, it takes time, obviously, but once again, then it's within this framework that people and states basically have to defend their positions.
Thank you. And next question by Céline Losato from Globes.
L'Observateur.
Floor is yours. Can you hear us? Unmute. 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 Oh,
There you go.
now we can hear you. Go on.
Oh, you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So,
Claude.
oh, excuse me.
Okay, we can't hear you, Céline. So perhaps, let me see if I can see your question in the chat. If not, we will go to the next one. Maybe in the meantime, if Claude Trink can ask her question, and then I'll try to find Céline's question.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Okay, I heard Ambassador Farnaud mention the importance of the discussion and sitting discussion between Palestinians and Israel, but I didn't hear about any action by the European Union or by European countries exercised on the Palestinian to go and to engage into discussions, because we noted that immediately, even before the Trump plan was presented, there was a total rejection of any discussion. So what is the rationale of the attitude of the European countries?
Jean-Louis.
Yes, thank you. In fact, yes, we also passed the message to the Palestinians that the best solution would be to resume the talks. But of course, and I cannot speak for them. I don't want to speak for them, and I cannot speak for them. But my perception is that provided the circumstances, the conditions are met, the Palestinian Authority would be ready to resume talks. But then, of course, it's not. I cannot speak for them. But as far as we are concerned, as France and as European Union, and you can read the statements we issue regularly, we are in favor of resuming the talks. And once again, we go even beyond that. If you read our statements, we clearly refer to the fact that we call for both parties to avoid any unilateral act, and we mean it. We clearly mean it. So this is why we also ask the Palestinians to stay within the framework established by all these international rules I mentioned, including the Oslo agreements, and which means that basically we plead for negotiations and talk to both parties. And beyond that, we also have diplomatic talks. And in the meetings that we have with the Palestinian leaders, we tell them the same. So you're absolutely right. We have to push both sides, and we do. But clearly, now the last announcements were more on the Israeli side.
Okay, next on the list is Jean-Louis Velez, please.
Hello, thank you for a great call. I have a sort of a technical question. I've always used the word annexation. Most newspapers use the word annexation. On this call, I've heard people suggest we shouldn't use the word annexation and say sort of extension of sovereignty. Could you explain the subtle differences? And if all people now agree that we should change the terminology?
Dore, you would like to answer this question?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I actually have written several essays on this question because, as I said earlier, I noticed that our foreign minister, Abba Evan, already in July 1967, refused to have Israeli actions around Jerusalem designated as annexation, but rather as an extension of Israeli law and jurisdiction. Annexation refers to actions which are viewed by the international community, and rightly so, as war crimes. And we believe that we are exercising our jurisdiction in areas where we have historical rights. It's not as though we decided to take a chunk of Iraq and extend our law and jurisdiction there. It's appropriate that this discussion today is in the framework of 100 years since San Remo. Because in San Remo, the great powers after World War I got together and designated the area that was to become British Mandatory Palestine as a Jewish national home. We were not alien. I'm not saying use the Bible. I'm saying use what was regarded as international law by the prime ministers and foreign ministers of the leading European powers. But it seems that this has been forgotten, and therefore emphasizing or going back to San Remo is not a bad idea, because that will allow us to at least be on an even playing field with our neighbors who are contesting our claims to these territories. So if you're going to talk about
This question.
the status of this territorial dispute, using terms that aren't that don't imply war crimes, that don't imply what annexation implies, those terms should be preferred and not using the language of annexation.
Well, no, the question that was asked.
So we have a question from Harold Hyman from C News. Let me just pop out the question. He would like to know if the people of an exchange of territories between Israel and the Palestinians would still be possible after an Israeli annexation.
The proposal, that's a question to Jason. And namely, since in the Trump plan, if I understand the question, there is a territorial swap, how would Israeli application of sovereignty impact the possibility of a later territorial swap under the Trump plan?
I'm not sure I follow the question, meaning if areas that Israel today might apply sovereignty to, if down the road the two sides agree to take some of that and move it to a state of Palestine, is that the question?
If I understand the question properly, basically is asking, in the US plan, in the conceptual map, there are territorial swaps. Okay, so Israel takes 30% of the West Bank and gives the Palestinian about 15% in other areas, like in the south of Israel and so on. And if I understand the question correctly, should it not be done as one package? And if Israel starts moving on its own and applying sovereignty, would that still enable later on that territorial swap? That's the way I interpret the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Israel's doing when it applies sovereignty is also protecting those territorial areas that are anticipated to be swapped if the plan ends up being successful. So it's a natural outcome, but it could only come if there's a successful peace agreement. Israel would never give up that land today, only to find out that they hand over the keys to that land to an authority that has not yet made peace with it. I think I'm answering the question, but please tell me if I'm not.
Yeah, I think you are.
You had a question?
I did. I'd like to ask Ambassador Farnaud a follow-up question, jumping off of where Dore left off. So, Ambassador Farnaud, I acknowledge and respect that France and many, many other countries around the world have a firm position on what you describe as international law. I don't agree with the interpretation, but I respect that the interpretation exists. Are you suggesting that the United States Congress in 1995, when it passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act, and President Trump, when he recognized Jerusalem and moved the embassy based on our US law in 1995, and Secretary Pompeo, when he said that the settlements are not illegal per se, that the United States is violating international law? Or do you accept the fact that there is a difference of opinion between certain countries around the world, in this case, the United States and some others, and France and others? So which is it? Are we violating US international law also, the United States that is? Or is there a difference of opinion on international law?
Well, I think the point is not to discuss in detail every decision, but clearly, I think there is no hesitation in saying that you have international law decisions, in particular the UNSC resolutions, and in particular, for instance, Resolution 242, and more recently, in 2016, Resolution 2334, that clearly create obligations that define occupied territories. I think that might help as well in the debate concerning annexation or not. They define occupied territories clearly. And on that, the West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories. Well, more, of course, especially the West Bank now. And it creates obligation for third parties by calling upon all member states of the United Nations, to distinguish precisely between the state of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. So by decided unilaterally to annex part of the West Bank, and it was the same for Jerusalem. We consider the status of Jerusalem as still has to be decided according to the agreed parameters. So these decisions clearly are in violation of international law. I think that's the real framework.
Right. So to follow through, I mean, I think what you're saying is that the Trump administration and the US Congress in 1995 violated international law by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We obviously don't agree with that. So I think there's a difference of opinion. And I think one of the problems with achieving a peace deal is, unless everybody's willing to acknowledge there is a difference of opinion on this issue, we're going to go nowhere. I mean, you have the world's greatest superpower interpreting international law one way. You have very, very important countries like France and many, many others interpreting it differently. We have to agree that there's a difference of opinion. But if you don't agree there's a difference of opinion, then you're accusing the United States of violating international law the same way you're accusing Israel of violating international law.
I think we definitely have to discuss more on that. But clearly there is a difference. There's a difference of position between the countries, and there is a vast majority at the United Nations that still think the way I just presented the position we have. Sure. But I totally agree with you on the fact that we should discuss more.
Thank you.
Definitely, we should discuss more, and many Israelis will tell you that when you define international law in terms of UN resolutions, you have to take into consideration that in many cases there is an automatic majority in the UN which is anti-Israeli, anti-US, and takes such decisions. And if you define that international law, I think many Israelis will disagree with you. Let's move to, we have room for one more question and then concluding remarks because time is short. Pierre Dassas, please. Pierre? Yeah, unmute. Okay.
I'm on the air.
Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is for the French ambassador, Christophe Farnaud. Globally, the position of France didn't change for 50 years. Europe is not anymore united on that. And when you talk to the countries of the Visegrad group, when you talk to Greece, when you talk to Latvia, that represents about 10 countries out of the 27, they absolutely do not agree with France. So when you talk about the position of European Union, it's not true anymore. My question is simple. When could we expect an evolution of the French diplomacy if France still wants to play any role in this area? Do you think that France is a clever position for building Europe? That's my question.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't hear the end of the question, but I think I got the meaning of it. I mentioned before, you're right, the European Union is less united nowadays than it was a few years ago. But that said, the majority of the European Union states and member states share the same analysis. And even among the states that are not in favor of a statement, for instance, most of the time when we have discussions, they share the analysis. It's just that then they do not go to the same conclusions. So we will keep talking among ourselves. And as you can see, at times we still have European positions, and more than once. And for instance, for instance, recently, there was no statement by the 27 member states, but there was a statement by the High Representative, Josep Borrell. And so, and Josep Borrell speaks in the name of the European Union. And as a politician and a professional, if he says what he says, it's because he knows that he can speak in the name of the European Union the way he does. So I don't say that what you said is true, but what I mean is that it's more nuanced, and there is still more unity within the European Union than what you described. As for our position, by the way, yes, the principles will remain, but I mean, when you think your position is the right one, or at least corresponds to what you think is right, once again, being open to discussion, we don't have to change the main lines. But if you look over the years, yes, we have evolved. There are many topics that were not that central to the issue, and now that are more central, and so we take it into account. There was the reality of what was happening in the Palestinian territories, and we take it into account, etc., etc. So the fact that the principles remain, the three things I mentioned, for instance, including the two-state solution, does not mean that we do not suggest and do not discuss. But I think and I think that's the best way to play your role. Although also, as we don't do it for our own sake, we do it because it's also our interest. But basically, the idea is to favor more discussion between the parties, and that's how we can do. And that's why when I mentioned the fact that right now we are not in a logic of sanction or threat, it's precisely because now we would prefer to be supporting the resuming of talks with a positive development and positive process between the parties.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, time is up, and we have to conclude. We'll take a few more minutes for brief concluding remarks by our speakers, and we'll do it in a reverse order. So let's start with you, Dore.
I just thought it would be useful. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I thought it would just be useful to conclude with definitions, because again, people are swearing on a stack of Bibles that they support international law. And, there are very problematic aspects of international law that no one's paying attention to. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, defines annexation as, quote, a unilateral act of a state through which it proclaims its sovereignty over the territory of another state, unquote. Now, why am I putting this on the table? Because I don't remember a single European state that recognized the sovereignty of Jordan over the West Bank back between, let's say, 1948 or 1950 and 1967. So if the situation in the West Bank is unique, but doesn't fit into the standard definitions that international law uses, then it is inappropriate to condemn Israel in terms that don't apply. And I'd like to leave that as, one of my conclusions as we go down this road of talking about international law.
Thank you very much, Dore. Ambassador Farnaud, the floor is yours for brief concluding remarks.
Very much. I think I spoke too much already. Just two words. One to thank you all for this discussion, Elnet and the other speakers, and wishing that we can go on talking precisely because we agree that we don't agree. And second thing, maybe as keywords, maybe a realistic hope, because I think that we still must be hopeful and work for a lasting solution. And once again, I won't restate my position. But in the same way, I said realistic, because clearly by saying what I said, I don't mean that it will be easy. It is difficult, it will remain very difficult, but precisely this is why we have to work collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Jason, final words.
Yes, thank you for hosting. I want to personally thank Ambassador Farnaud for being very gracious with his answers to my questions. And what I'd like to do now is just change the paradigm for a minute, which is when people take a forceful position and make it seem very black and white, that international law says this, or international parameters say this, or the Arab Peace Initiative is the way to go, I think that that is not going to bring about peace. But when people can agree that there are disagreements on these things, you have Dore Gold saying this, Ambassador Farnaud saying that, when we accept and acknowledge that there are differences of opinions here, and are willing to say that out loud, then I think we have a chance and a hope and a prayer of reaching the peace agreement. So I hope everybody leaves this conference, and I think we should all leave here and spread the word forward to remind people how extraordinarily complicated this conflict is, how that there are so many different opinions on international law and many of the other issues, and that the only way we will achieve a peace agreement is by acknowledging that and trying to work through them rather than using dogmatic statements that mean something to our own base or people or supporters, but mean nothing to the other side.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes this conference. It was fascinating. Obviously, there are differences of opinion, and the idea of this platform is to confront conflicting positions and opinions and different paradigms, and I think we've done it. And to borrow from Ambassador Farnaud, this calls for much more dialogue, deep dialogue. I want to thank everybody for participating, contributing. Thank you all, and see you in our next conference.